Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the story. In the small, quiet town of Brooksville, 23-year-old Mark Davis was facing a crossroads. Struggling with mounting student loans, unpaid bills, and the pressure of his final year of law school, he felt like the walls were closing in. He walked through the rain, his worn-out jacket doing little to keep him warm. It had been another long day of endless classes and a part-time job that barely covered his expenses. With each step, he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but there was nothing he could do except keep moving forward. It was then that his phone buzzed in his pocket. The message was brief but strange. This is Eleanor Brooks. Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. regarding your financial situation. His first instinct was to ignore it. Well, was this woman, and why was she reaching out? But something about the message intrigued him, something he couldn't quite place. Maybe he was just desperate for any opportunity to escape the never-ending cycle of debt. So, he decided to go. As Mark entered the bistro, the warm glow of the lights and the soft murmur of conversation offered a temporary reprieve from the rain and his worries. He scanned the room for a woman matching the name, and there she was, Eleanor Brooks. She sat at a corner table, her silver hair neatly styled and her business attire as sharp as her presence. She looked like someone who had everything, someone who never had to worry about money. Mark felt out of place immediately. He adjusted his jacket and walked over, trying to keep his nerves in check. "Mr. Davis, right?" Eleanor greeted him, her voice calm yet authoritative. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit." Mark hesitated for a moment but then took a seat, not sure what to expect. He had no idea who this woman was, but her confident demeanor made him feel both nervous and curious. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked to meet you," Eleanor continued, her eyes studying him intently. "You've been struggling financially, and I've been following your situation. I have a proposition for you. I need a husband, and you need a way out of your debts. Let's make a deal. Marry me, and I'll pay off your loans, take care of your financial problems. There will be no love involved, just a simple agreement to help each other. What do you say?" Mark sat frozen, the words barely sinking in. Was she joking? He had heard of arranged marriages in the past, but this felt different, almost unreal. His mind raced, wondering what kind of woman would make such a proposal. Eleanor was beautiful, wealthy, and clearly used to getting what she wanted. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. Could he even afford to turn this down? He had nothing left to lose. Finally, he managed to say, I don't know. This is insane. Why would you want to marry someone like me?" "Because, Mr. Davis, I don't want love," Eleanor replied coolly. "I want companionship, someone to help me secure my legacy. You're young, you're unattached, and you're in a situation where you can't afford to say no. Think of it as a business arrangement. We'll both get what we need." Mark stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her offer sinking in. On the one hand, this could solve all of his problems. On the other hand, something about the idea of marrying a woman he barely knew didn't sit right with him. But then, his thoughts turned to his mother's medical bills, the overdue rent, the mounting pressure. Was he really in a position to refuse her? He leaned back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Eleanor Brooks, a woman with more wealth than he could ever dream of, was offering him a way out of his mess. Was it worth it? Could he live with himself knowing this was his only way out? "I'll do it," Mark said, his voice low, resigned. "I'll marry you." Eleanor smiled faintly, as if she had expected this response all along. "Good," she said simply. "The arrangements will be made immediately. We'll draw up the contract. This will be a business deal, nothing more." And so, Mark Davis, a struggling law student with no real future, found himself agreeing to marry a woman he barely knew, a woman who had offered him a way out, but who also came with her own set of rules. What had he just gotten himself into? But, as they both left the bistro that evening, neither of them could have known just how much their lives would change in the days that followed. Neither could have known that this contract, this fake marriage, would eventually lead to something neither of them had expected, a real connection. Mark's decision was made, but as he left the bistro that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just agreed to something he would deeply regret. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the conversation hung heavily in the air. Eleanor had left him with no time to think, just a simple nod and the promise of an agreement being drawn up. He walked home that night in a daze, his mind racing. What had he just done? Was he truly about to marry a woman he barely knew for the sake of money? He couldn't help but replay her calm, collected words over and over in his head. "It's just a business arrangement," she'd said. "No love involved." Was that even possible? Could a marriage without love truly work? The next day, as Mark sat in his small, cluttered apartment, staring at his phone, he received an email from Eleanor's lawyer. It was time to formalize the agreement. He didn't know what to expect, but the email made everything feel real. His heart pounded as he clicked open the document, reading through the terms carefully. There it was, everything he had agreed to. A simple contract. He would marry Eleanor within the week. The debts would be paid off. His life would be different. But was this the answer to all his problems? Later that afternoon, Mark met Eleanor at her office. Her building stood tall, a symbol of her success. It was everything he was not. When he arrived, he was shown to a large, sterile meeting room where Eleanor was already seated, looking just as poised and in control as before. He felt a pang of discomfort. This was not the same woman he had met the night before. Here, she was a powerful businesswoman, and he was just a law student with nothing to offer. She handed him the pen. "Sign the contract, and we'll get started," she said without missing a beat. There was no warmth in her voice, just business. Mark hesitated. His hand hovered over the paper for a moment. This was a huge step, something he could never take back, but when he thought of his mother's medical bills, of the sleepless nights worrying about how to keep his head above water, his resolve hardened. He signed the contract. Eleanor's lawyer quickly filed the paperwork, and just like that, the deal was done. The wedding came sooner than he expected. It wasn't a grand affair, just a small ceremony in a private room at a courthouse. Eleanor stood beside him, her expression unreadable as they exchanged vows. There were no flowers, no guests, just the sound of the officiant's voice filling the sterile space. When it was over, Eleanor turned to him, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm and controlled. Mark stood there, feeling like he was trapped in someone else's story. As they left the courthouse, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. This wasn't what he had imagined marriage to be. It wasn't even close. He had no real connection with Eleanor, just a cold agreement, and yet, something about her kept him thinking. She wasn't like the women he had known. There was a strength in her, a quiet power. But what was her true motive? Was she just as lonely as he was? The next few days were a blur of paperwork and meetings. Eleanor was always busy with work, and Mark had no place in her world except as her husband. He moved into her mansion, a grand, cold house that seemed to echo with silence. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it didn't feel like home. The vastness of it made him feel smaller, like he was just a guest in someone else's life. He spent his days trying to adjust, but the emptiness of the house gnawed at him. Was this really all there was to life? Money? Power? Despite the cold distance between them, Mark couldn't ignore the quiet moments he shared with Eleanor. Every now and then, she would pause, look at him, and for a brief moment, her mask would slip. He could see a flicker of something, vulnerability, maybe. It wasn't much, but it was there, and it kept him wondering what lay beneath the surface. Eleanor had always been in control, but what if she, too, was just trying to survive? As the days turned into weeks, Mark couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. But at the same time, he felt like he was slowly being drawn into Eleanor's world. She had offered him everything he needed: financial stability, security, but he was beginning to realize that he needed something more. He needed connection. He needed love. And as hard as he tried to ignore it, he knew he couldn't stay in this cold, empty marriage forever. One night, after a long day, Eleanor came home late. She looked tired, more so than usual, and for the first time since they had met, Mark saw her look vulnerable. She dropped her briefcase by the door and leaned against the wall, rubbing her temples. Mark watched her for a moment before stepping forward. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, startled by the concern in his voice. For a second, she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "I'm fine," she said, but Mark could see the weariness in her eyes. Something shifted between them in that moment, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. It was the first real conversation they had ever had, and Mark realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this marriage than just a contract. And just like that, Mark started to wonder if this marriage could be more than what it seemed. End of part 2. Mark stood at the window of the mansion late one night, gazing out at the city lights that seemed so far away. He felt disconnected, as if the world outside was moving on while he remained stuck in this strange, quiet life with Eleanor. The weight of the decision he had made pressed down on him every day. He had agreed to marry her, not out of love, but out of desperation. Yet, something had changed in him over the past few weeks. Eleanor's presence had slowly begun to fill the emptiness he had felt since his mother's illness and his constant struggles. But was this enough? Was this enough to truly change his life? He turned away from the window and walked down the long hallway of the mansion. The house felt colder than usual tonight. He didn't know why he felt the way he did, distant, but also strangely drawn to Eleanor. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and for the first time, he realized that she wasn't just a cold businesswoman. She was human, just like him, with fears and insecurities. She had built this fortress around herself, but there were moments when it seemed like she wanted to tear it down. Tonight, as he passed by her office, he noticed the faint glow of light still spilling through the door. She was working again. Mark knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. Eleanor was sitting at her desk, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a hint of concern. For a moment, Mark didn't know what to say. He had never really spoken to her about how he was feeling and just been going through the motions of this marriage, pretending that everything was fine. But tonight, he couldn't pretend anymore. "I just wanted to check on you," Mark said, his voice low. "You've been working so much lately. Are you all right?" Eleanor paused, looking at him for a long moment. It was as if she was deciding whether or not to let her guard down. For a second, he thought she would brush him off. But then, she sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound, and leaned back in her chair. "I'm fine," she said softly. "But thank you for asking." She paused again, and this time, Mark could see the weariness in her eyes. "I don't know why I'm still doing this. Running everything, controlling everything. I thought I could handle it all. But sometimes, I feel like I'm losing control." Her voice cracked ever so slightly at the end, and Mark's heart ached for her. For the first time since they had met, Eleanor seemed completely vulnerable. The strong, confident woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone who was just trying to survive. Mark took a few steps closer, unsure of what to do next. But something inside him urged him to act, to be there for her in the way that she had been there for him when he was drowning in his own struggles. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment. Then, he gently said, "You don't have to do it all alone." Eleanor looked at him, her gaze searching his face, as if looking for any sign of sincerity. She didn't find it at first. But then, something in her softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I didn't expect you to understand," she said quietly. "But, thank you." The words seemed small, almost too small for everything she had been carrying inside. But in that moment, they meant everything. Mark didn't know why, but he suddenly felt closer to her. Maybe it was the way she had opened up to him, or maybe it was the realization that their marriage, while still fake on paper, had become something more than just a contract. Over the next few days, Mark found himself looking at Eleanor differently. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was a person who had faced countless challenges on her own, just like him. And, for the first time in a long time, he felt like they might be able to face those challenges together. There was still a long road ahead, but something had shifted between them. Eleanor was no longer just a businesswoman he had agreed to marry for financial security. She was someone who had become important to him. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully. "Mark, I know this wasn't the way you imagined your life turning out. I can't pretend that this marriage is perfect. But I need you to know. I appreciate you being here. You've given me something I didn't realize I needed." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time, Mark saw Eleanor as more than just a wealthy woman. He saw her as someone who needed him, just as much as he had needed her. Mark looked back at her, his heart beating faster than he had expected. "You're not alone anymore, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "We're in this together now." Eleanor's expression softened, and in that moment, Mark realized that maybe, just maybe, this fake marriage was turning into something real. Something they could both hold on to. And as the evening faded into night, Mark knew that their story was only just beginning. End of part 3. Mark's days had started to blend into one another. He had become more comfortable in the mansion, yet something was still missing. He had agreed to this marriage out of necessity, but now, as time passed, he could no longer deny the change he felt in himself. He had developed a connection with Eleanor, something deeper than just the empty words on a contract. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a bond he hadn't expected. Every small moment they shared, from the quiet dinners to the rare conversations, made him feel more alive than he had in years. One evening, as he was walking through the grand hallway, he overheard Eleanor talking on the phone. He paused, not meaning to eavesdrop, but her tone was different, tense. She was speaking with a business partner about a major deal. The conversation was serious, filled with the language of investments and negotiations, but there was something else in her voice, something that made Mark wonder if there was more to her than the cold, calculating businesswoman he had seen at the start. She was in control, yes, but there was also a weight on her shoulders he hadn't fully understood until now. After she hung up, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. She didn't hear Mark approach. For a brief moment, Mark saw her as she really was, not the powerful CEO, not the woman who had offered him a contract marriage, but a person who was struggling to keep everything together. "Eleanor," he called gently. She turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes before the mask quickly slipped back into place. "You heard that?" she asked, her voice betraying nothing. Mark shook his head, stepping closer. "No, but I could tell something was wrong." "You've been under a lot of pressure lately," Mark said, his voice soft but concerned. For a moment, Eleanor didn't respond. She just stood there, looking at him as if deciding whether to let him in. The air between them felt charged, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice quieter now. "It's just a lot. The company, the deals, my family. I keep thinking I can handle it all, but lately, I don't know." She paused, looking out the window again, her fingers lightly touching the glass. "Sometimes, I wonder if it's all worth it. The power, the success, it's nothing without someone to share it with." Mark's heart ached as he listened. It wasn't the Eleanor he had expected to meet. This woman, strong and fearless on the outside, was revealing a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. He took a step closer, feeling the distance between them shrink. "You don't have to carry everything alone, you know," he said quietly. "I'm here. We're in this together." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, there was nothing but the silence between them. But it wasn't awkward. It was something else, a quiet understanding. "You really mean that?" she asked, almost in disbelief. Mark nodded, his gaze steady. "I do," he said. "I may not have expected any of this, but I'm not going anywhere." There it was, those words, the ones he hadn't even realized he needed to say. Eleanor looked at him, her expression softening. She didn't say anything at first, but the way she looked at him told him everything. He wasn't just her husband on paper anymore. He was becoming something more to her. And maybe, just maybe, this arrangement was turning into something real. The next day, Eleanor invited Mark to accompany her to a business gala. It was one of those events where the powerful and influential gathered, but for Mark, it was a reminder of how far apart they still were in terms of the world they inhabited. The gala was a display of opulence and prestige. Mark felt a little out of place among the elegantly dressed guests, but Eleanor, as usual, carried herself with grace and confidence. As they arrived, Mark noticed how Eleanor's presence seemed to command the room. She was greeted by business partners, investors, and dignitaries, each one eager to talk to her. Mark stood by her side, trying to blend in, but he couldn't help but watch as Eleanor handled everything with ease. She was in her element here, and he was just a shadow in her world. But that didn't bother him. For the first time, he understood the weight she carried, the responsibilities that came with her success. She wasn't just a cold, distant woman, she was a force to be reckoned with. And somehow, he had become a part of her world. As the evening went on, Mark found himself drawn to Eleanor more and more. He could see how much effort she put into everything, how much she had to sacrifice. There were no easy answers in her world. And as they shared a quiet moment together away from the crowd, he realized something. This marriage, which had started as a contract, had become something more. It had become a partnership. And in that moment, Mark felt something stir inside him, a flicker of hope, of something real growing between them. Later that night, as they left the gala, Eleanor turned to him with a small smile. "Thank you for coming with me," she said. "It's been a while since I've had someone to talk to about all of this." Mark nodded, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. But he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer just a husband in name. He was becoming someone important to her, and as they drove back to the mansion, the weight of the evening settled in. Mark knew that their relationship was far from perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still things they didn't understand about each other. But tonight, for the first time, he felt like he was truly a part of her world. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. End of part 4. Weeks passed since the gala, and life seemed to settle into a rhythm that neither Mark nor Eleanor had expected. The mansion felt less like a foreign space to Mark and more like a home, though a home that still held an air of distance, a distance that both of them felt but didn't address. Their marriage, which had started as a simple agreement, now contained moments of warmth that Mark hadn't anticipated. He started to look at Eleanor differently, not just as the powerful CEO he had married for financial stability, but as a woman who carried the weight of a world he could never fully understand. One morning, Eleanor asked him to accompany her to a meeting at her office. Mark had grown accustomed to the space, the sleek glass and steel that reflected her success. But today was different. Eleanor seemed more distracted than usual, her face tight with a quiet tension that Mark had learned to read. He hadn't seen her this way in weeks, and it made him realize how much she had been hiding behind the facade of confidence. As they entered her office, she took a seat at her desk, her hands resting lightly on the papers in front of her. "I'm facing a decision I never thought I'd have to make," Eleanor said, her voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of unease. Mark stood by the door, watching her, unsure of what to say. Eleanor wasn't a woman who showed weakness, but he could see it now, something in her eyes, something that said she was tired. "I have an offer to sell part of the company," she continued, looking up at him for the first time. "It's a good offer, one that could make me even richer, but it would mean losing control. Losing everything I've worked for." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Mark felt a pang of sympathy for her, but he didn't know how to help. He had always been the one struggling with financial burdens, with choices that seemed to suffocate him. But here, in this moment, Eleanor was the one carrying that weight, and he couldn't help but wonder if, in some way, this was the cost of all her success. "What do you want to do?" Mark asked softly, his voice almost a whisper. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't give him an answer right away. She just sat there, looking at him as if she were searching for something in his eyes. He could see that she wasn't just asking about the business deal anymore. She was asking for something else, something more personal. Something neither of them had dared to ask before. After a long silence, Eleanor finally spoke. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. Not just the business, but all of it. The constant pressure, the loneliness of it all. I thought I could handle it, but sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself. I can't do this alone anymore, Mark." Her voice faltered, and for a split second, Mark saw the woman she truly was: tired, vulnerable, afraid. It was the first time he had heard her admit to weakness, and it struck him harder than he expected. Mark took a step forward, crossing the room slowly. He had always known that Eleanor was a woman of strength, but in this moment, she needed something different. She needed someone who could be there for her without expectations, someone who could offer her the support she had always given to others. He sat beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. "You don't have to do this alone, Eleanor," he said gently. "Whatever it is, whatever decision you make, I'm here. We're in this together." He didn't know if his words were the right ones, but they felt true. And somehow, he knew they were exactly what she needed to hear. For the first time since their wedding, Eleanor looked at him not as her business partner, not as her husband in name only but as someone who truly cared about her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but full of gratitude. She didn't need to say anything more. The weight of the moment settled between them, and Mark realized that this marriage, once so cold and businesslike, had become something far more meaningful. In the days that followed, Eleanor made her decision. She chose not to sell the company. She chose to fight for it, to keep what she had built with her own hands. But it wasn't just the company she was fighting for. She was fighting for herself, for the person she had become, and for the relationship she and Mark were slowly building together. Mark stood by her side, not as a man bound by contract, but as a partner in the truest sense of the word. One evening, as they sat in the living room together, Eleanor turned to him with a small smile. "I've never thanked you properly," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "For everything. For being here, for being who you are." Mark met her gaze, his heart beating faster than it had in a long time. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "We're in this together. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm glad we're facing it side by side." And in that moment, Mark realized that the life he had once dreaded was no longer a burden. It was a life that he was learning to love. End of part 5. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor found a new rhythm in their marriage. What had once started as a cold, calculated arrangement was now slowly transforming into something more meaningful. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract, they were becoming a team, learning to rely on each other in ways neither of them had expected. Mark spent more time at Eleanor's side, helping with business decisions, and sometimes just being there to listen when she needed to talk. He learned about the pressures she faced, the sacrifices she had made, and the loneliness that had always lingered in her life, despite her success. One morning, Eleanor walked into the living room, her expression serious. Mark looked up from his book, sensing the shift in the air. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but there was an edge to it that made Mark put his book down immediately. He had seen this side of her before, the one that didn't shy away from difficult conversations. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle, yet concerned. "There's something I need to tell you," Eleanor began. "Something I should have told you sooner." She paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not sure how to say this, but I think you should know the truth about the company." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never asked Eleanor to explain the full details of her business dealings. It wasn't his place, after all. But he could see now that there was more to the story than he had realized. "What truth?" Mark asked, leaning forward. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing. "The company, it's facing a serious challenge. There are competitors trying to take us down from the inside. I've been dealing with it for months, trying to keep it under wraps, but it's getting harder to manage." She let the words hang in the air, waiting for Mark's reaction. Mark sat still for a moment, absorbing what she had said. He had always known Eleanor had been under pressure, but he had never imagined things were this serious. "What can we do?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze softening. "We," she repeated. "I didn't think you'd want to be involved in this. It's my fight, Mark, but I've realized something. You're not just my husband on paper anymore. You've been here for me in ways I never expected. I can't do this alone. Not anymore." The vulnerability in her voice caught Mark off guard. This was the woman who had built an empire, the woman who had made every decision with precision. And now, she was asking for his help. Mark stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll figure this out together." Eleanor looked up at him, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty in her eyes. She had always been the strong one, the one who controlled everything. To let someone else in, especially Mark, was something she had never done before. Over the next few days, they worked together, tackling the problems at the company Heaton. Eleanor was still the driving force, but now Mark was at her side, offering his ideas and support. He didn't have her business acumen, but he had a different kind of perspective, one that allowed him to think outside the box. Slowly but surely, their efforts started to pay off. They were making progress, and for the first time, Eleanor seemed to relax a little. The weight that had been hanging over her was lifting. One evening, after a long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Eleanor and Mark sat on the couch in the living room, the soft hum of the city outside their window. "I never thought I'd be able to do this," Eleanor said, her voice quiet. "Trust someone the way I trust you." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm glad you do," he said softly. "Because I trust you too, and I'm not going anywhere." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their words settling between them. Mark had come into this marriage thinking it was just a way out of his financial troubles, but now, he couldn't imagine his life without Eleanor. The feelings that had once been buried under the surface, feelings of admiration, affection, and respect, were now impossible to ignore. And as Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, Mark knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. But there was still one thing left unspoken between them, one thing neither of them had dared to acknowledge yet. They had come so far, but they hadn't reached the end of their journey. The connection they shared was real, but there was still something missing, something neither of them could define. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of hope, not just for the future, but for the possibility of love that he had never expected to find in this marriage. End of part 6. As the days went by, Eleanor and Mark's relationship grew deeper. What had once been a marriage of convenience was now something neither of them could ignore. Mark had never expected to feel this way. He had come into this arrangement with a plan to pay off his debts and move on with his life. But now, the feelings he had buried deep inside began to surface. He couldn't deny it anymore, cared about Eleanor. And it wasn't just about being partners in business. He wanted something more, but he wasn't sure if Eleanor felt the same. One evening, as they sat together in the living room after a long day, Eleanor turned to him, her face serious. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but determined. "We need to talk." Mark looked at her, sensing that something important was coming. "What's on your mind?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though a sense of dread filled his chest. "There's something I've been avoiding," Eleanor began, her eyes searching his face for any sign of understanding. "I've been so focused on the business, on keeping everything under control, that I've neglected something that's been right in front of me the whole time." She paused, and Mark's heart began to race. What was she about to say? Was she going to end things between them, return to the cold businesswoman he had first met? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, and Mark could feel the weight of Eleanor's words hanging between them. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to care for you, Mark. This was supposed to be just an arrangement business, no feelings involved. But somewhere along the way, I found myself changing. And I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to deal with you." Her words were raw, vulnerable, and it took everything Mark had not to reach out to her immediately. Mark felt his chest tighten. He had never heard Eleanor speak like this before, and it left him feeling exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had been too afraid to voice his own feelings, but now, hearing her speak so honestly, he couldn't hold back anymore. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. "I care about you too. I don't know what this is between us, but it's not just business anymore. I never thought I would find myself in this position, but I can't imagine my life without you. I'm not just here for the company, Eleanor. I'm here for you." His words hung in the air, vulnerable and uncertain, but full of truth. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't respond. She just sat there, her eyes searching his, trying to make sense of what he had just said. Mark had been afraid that she wouldn't feel the same, that she would brush him off, but instead, she reached out and took his hand in hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "I didn't want to admit it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want to be weak, to need someone. But I do. I need you, Mark." Those words, simple yet powerful, broke through the last of the walls Eleanor had built around herself. And in that moment, Mark knew that everything had changed. They sat there in silence, their hands intertwined, letting the gravity of the moment settle around them. This wasn't just a marriage, Anna Marie, it was something deeper, something real. They had both been afraid to admit it, but now, the truth was undeniable. They had built something together, and it wasn't just a contract. It was a partnership in every sense of the word. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Eleanor rested her head on Mark's shoulder. For the first time, Mark didn't feel like an outsider in her world. He had found a place beside her, not as a business partner, but as someone who truly mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor allowed herself to feel what she had been too afraid to acknowledge. She was no longer alone. End of part 7. Days passed, and Mark and Eleanor's bond continued to grow. The connection they had built, first forged through necessity, was now becoming something that neither of them could ignore. They were no longer just two people fulfilling a contract, they were partners, in every sense of the word. Their relationship was evolving, deeper and more complicated than either of them had planned. They spent more time together, not just working on the company, but talking about their lives, their dreams, and the future. Eleanor had opened up in ways she never had before, and Mark found himself drawn to her, not just for her strength, but for the vulnerabilities she had shown him. The woman he had married was no longer just the powerful CEO, but someone he was beginning to care about, in ways he hadn't expected. But as their connection deepened, the reality of their situation began to weigh on them both. Despite the growing affection between them, the foundation of their relationship was still built on a contract. They had promised each other that this marriage was not about love, but somewhere along the way, that promise had started to feel like a lie. Eleanor had been upfront with Mark from the start, but even she couldn't deny that she had begun to rely on him more than she ever thought possible. One evening, after another long day of business meetings, Eleanor sat across from Mark in the living room, her eyes searching his face. "Mark," she said, her voice softer than usual. "There's something we need to talk about." Mark looked up from the papers he had been reading, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting the papers down. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking," she began slowly. "About us, about this marriage. We've been living in this, in-between place, haven't we? It started as a business arrangement, and somewhere along the way, it became more. But the question is, what is it now? What do we have, really?" Mark could feel the weight of her words. He had been wondering the same thing, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. "I don't know," Mark admitted, his voice steady but unsure. I think we've both changed. And maybe that's what we've been avoiding. What we don't know is whether we can let go of the past. Can we stop pretending this is just a deal and admit that there's more at stake now?" His words hung in the air between them, the question neither of them had been willing to ask until now. Eleanor looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "I've always prided myself on being in control," she said quietly. "But I don't feel in control anymore. I don't know what I'm doing, Mark. I don't know what I want. I just know that what we have is different. And I don't know how to deal with that." Her voice cracked slightly, and Mark could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Mark reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together. Whatever it is we have, we'll face it. We don't have to have all the answers right now." Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time, there was no mask, no facade. Just two people, being honest about their fears and their desires. There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of truth, a moment where they both understood the weight of what they had built. Eleanor knew she couldn't keep pretending, not to herself or to Mark. And Mark realized that he didn't want to walk away from her, not now, not ever. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't imagine a future without her. "I think we need to stop pretending this is just a contract," Eleanor said quietly. "We need to decide what this is. What we are. And then, we need to decide where we go from here." Mark nodded, his heart pounding as he realized the gravity of the moment. They were standing on the edge of something new, something they hadn't planned for, but something they both wanted. As they sat there in the quiet of the evening, Mark knew that this was the turning point. Their marriage, which had once been a lifeline, was now a choice. A choice to either continue down the path they had started on, or to step into the unknown together, as a real couple, without the boundaries of a contract. And in that moment, Mark knew that whatever choice they made, he wanted to make it with Eleanor by his side. End of part 8. The next few days were filled with long conversations and quiet moments of reflection. Eleanor and Mark had made a decision to move forward, to let go of the past, and to finally admit that their marriage, once built on a business agreement, had become something far more significant. The walls that had separated them, both physically and emotionally, began to crumble, and for the first time, they were truly on the same page. They were no longer pretending. They were in this together, truly, fully together. One evening, as they sat side by side in the living room, the weight of everything they had been through seemed to settle in. Eleanor, who had always been so composed, now looked at Mark with a tenderness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. I never thought I'd need someone. But with you, I feel like I've found something real, something I didn't know I was missing." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with emotions he had never allowed himself to feel before. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was peaceful, comfortable, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had changed. Mark squeezed her hand, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Eleanor, I never expected this either. I came into this marriage thinking it was just about survival, but it's been so much more. You've shown me what it means to truly care for someone, to stand by them no matter what. And I'm not going anywhere. I don't just want this marriage to work, I want us to be happy. Together." Eleanor's eyes glistened as she looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't seem like the untouchable businesswoman. She was simply Eleanor, someone he could imagine a future with. The next day, they sat down to have a serious conversation about their future. They talked about what they wanted, where they saw themselves in the years to come, and how they would build their life together, not as a business partnership, but as equals. The foundation of their relationship had changed, and so had their outlook on what it meant to be together. No longer just partners by contract, they were now partners by choice. Eleanor stood in front of the window that overlooked the city, the sunlight catching her hair, and she turned to Mark, a soft smile on her lips. "I think we've built something worth fighting for," she said quietly. "I don't need the power, the success, or the wealth anymore. What I need is you. What I need is us." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had feared that their connection might be fleeting, that the reality of their situation would eventually tear them apart, but now he saw it clearly. They had something real, something that was stronger than any contract. Mark walked over to her, taking her hand in his. "We're in this together," he said with a certainty that surprised even him. "And no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. In that moment, Mark realized that everything they had gone through, the struggles, the doubts, the challenges, had brought them to this point. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And together, they would find a future filled with love, trust, and partnership. As they embraced, the weight of their past seemed to lift, replaced with the excitement of a new beginning. This was no longer just a marriage of convenience, it was a marriage of love, of commitment, and of two people who had found in each other what they had always been searching for. And so, with the promise of a new chapter, Mark and Eleanor stood side by side, ready to face the future together. No longer bound by a contract, they were free to build a life based on trust, love, and the understanding that they had found something that was more than either of them had ever imagined. End of part 9.